Dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this FIIA webinar on energy transition towards a hydrogen economy, prospects, challenges, and geopolitical implications. My name is Marko Sidi, and I'm Senior Research Fellow at this institute. I'm also leading and coordinating a new project on the global politics of the energy transition. And this is the first series, in a series of webinar for this project. Apologies for the slight delay. I hope now everyone is able to access the webinar using the link. I will briefly introduce the topic and the key questions that we'll discuss today with our excellent speakers. So the use of hydrogen as an energy carrier is being scaled up rapidly by several countries in the global north and beyond. The EU and several of its member states have ambitious hydrogen strategies. While hydrogen today is still produced primarily from fossil sources, green hydrogen produced from renewable energy can help decarbonize especially hard-to-abate sectors such as long-distance transportation and heavy industry. However, for this to happen, several challenges have to be overcome. For example, reducing production costs, improving technology, and building adequate infrastructure. Hydrogen will likely contribute to decentralizing energy systems, increase the number of producers who will become also prosumers more and more, and possibly alleviate energy-related geopolitical conflicts that are typical of the fossil fuel era. So the key questions we'll address today are how will energy systems be affected by the rise of the hydrogen economy? What will be the geopolitical consequences, for example, in terms of major power competition and North-South relations? And what are the prospects for the international governance of hydrogen? I will now introduce the speakers one by one before the presentations. So let me start with Dr. Rainer Quitzow, who is research group leader at the Research Institute for Sustainability, Helmholtz Center, Potsdam. Now, I could say a lot about Rainer's expertise in this field, but let me just mention that he's currently leading 3 projects on hydrogen. One on techno-economic and political dimensions of a global hydrogen economy, one on geopolitics of the energy transformation, implications of an international hydrogen economy, and finally one on global potentials for the production and export of green hydrogen. So Rainer will tell us about Germany's and the EU's hydrogen strategy, including techno-economic and geopolitical aspects, and possibly more. So Rainer, thanks for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Marko, for the kind introduction. I hope everybody can hear me. And now I'm gonna share my slides. See how that works. All right. And now I hope you can also see my, okay, great. So yeah, I'm just gonna, Marko, maybe just remind me how long you anticipated this to be, maybe 10, 15 minutes?
Exactly.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, so I'll be talking a little bit about the geopolitics of hydrogen and taking sort of a European perspective, but then also broadening it to the sort of global scope that this new international sector, this hydrogen economy, is developing. And like Marko said, I mean, we're working on a number of projects, one on the geopolitics funded by the Foreign Office, and then one where we work together with Andreas Stamm, who's going to be speaking in a minute as well, on the global hydrogen potentials, funded by the Ministry of Education and Research. And yeah, what we try to do is we try to do some more basic research, especially on policy developments, and then translate that into very actionable outputs that you see here on the screen. So maybe to start off, when we talk about the geopolitics of hydrogen and we talk about the European position in that developing sector, we have to acknowledge that Europe is definitely the region in the world with the least, or one of the regions with the least potential to really produce its own renewable hydrogen. We see here on the map both China, which is sort of captured under Northeast and rest of Asia in a sense, has significantly more potential to produce renewable hydrogen, and the US or North America even more so. And then if we see here some of the other regions. So Europe is an energy scarce continent that has to really think about how, as it enters this new energy market, how it wants to really position itself and develop and needs to think about the new dependencies that it's going to be developing. I mean, we've learned, or Europe has learned, that dependencies can be a very big risk. So of course, the big question is, are we just going to be trading old dependencies for new ones? What are the implications of these new dependencies? How do we want to develop them in a way that Europe doesn't become vulnerable? And I mean, I guess the good news, and this is a result from partners in the HIPAT project and the project on the potentials for producing hydrogen, is that, I mean, Europe, despite the relatively scarce energy resources or renewable resources that it has, could produce substantial amounts of hydrogen. But of course, this comes with trade-offs. We see here on the left the potential along different price points. And then on the other side, we see some scenarios, the blue and the gray, with different shares of hydrogen. We also see that hydrogen, if the more hydrogen, that's the blue, we utilize for decarbonization, the more energy we need in total, the more renewable energy we need in total. So there's a trade-off there in expanding the use of hydrogen into too many sectors. We just need more renewables then. But the message here is mainly that this is the technical potential for renewable energy, electricity generation, and Europe does have the potential to produce a significant amount. But that doesn't mean that that's necessarily the best avenue that Europe can take, because of course, also within Europe, resources are distributed unevenly, and this doesn't mean that every location that has a high demand for hydrogen will have access, and it's a trade-off in terms of the impact on the continent. So what Europe is doing is kind of pursuing a two-pronged approach. It wants to very much develop a domestic production. It's targeting 10 million tons of domestic renewable hydrogen supply by 2030, but also it's trying to stimulate production abroad. So it's trying to stimulate the production of 10 million tons of imported hydrogen that is then imported into the European Union also by 2030. Just to put that in perspective, that equates to about 500 terawatt hours of electricity production each, which is about half of what the European Union produces today as renewable electricity. So it would mean that just in a few years, the European Union would have to increase its renewable energy production by 50% just to meet those goals. And of course, that should come on top of, and that's been also very clear in many very sort of complicated policy discussions in Europe, this is supposed to come on top of the development or the continued development of the renewable energy resources for electricity production for direct use as electricity, which is also going to be expanding the demand. So a huge challenge. It's maybe unrealistic also that these targets will really be met by 2030, but it shows you the ambition and the what European policymakers are hoping to achieve. Probably terms of the import target, I mean, the most active country in the European Union in actually pursuing these imports and trying to build partnerships with other countries that have potential, significantly more potential than Germany and the European Union to actually produce this renewable hydrogen is the German government. You can see here on this map that we put together all the different countries where different ministries, and that's the reason for the different colors, different ministries in Germany have built up some sort of partnership, cooperation, activities that engage where German policymakers engage with those other countries on hydrogen issues. And some of the most prominent ones are Namibia, South Africa, Morocco, Saudi Arabia. Those are some of the countries where the Kazakhstan more recently. So some very concrete activities that are happening, not necessarily in terms of actual projects being funded, but the initiatives are there. Also, a big sort of building block in Germany's international hydrogen strategy is the so-called H2 Global scheme. It's a scheme where they have already launched the first tender for international supply of hydrogen to be delivered at a port in Europe. That is part of the tenders. It has to be delivered to a port in Europe, where they tender the hydrogen on the one hand, and they buy the hydrogen. This intermediary, Hintco, buys the hydrogen. Then that hydrogen is resold in a second tender to those that want to use the hydrogen. And then if there is a gap between the price that was paid for the hydrogen and the price that was then achieved in that second tender from the hydrogen users that want to buy the hydrogen, then the government will cover that difference. So in a way, it's similar to a contracts for difference scheme set up in a somewhat different way. But ultimately, it's a way that Germany is trying to stimulate this international supply chain for imported hydrogen into Northern Europe, let's say, because it's targeting Northern European ports. So these are some very concrete activities. But of course, it's not just about the supply of hydrogen per se and using hydrogen to decarbonize different end-use sectors. It's also a very large investment opportunity, a competition for technological leadership in some of these technologies, especially in the this is just to give you some numbers of the volumes that this implies just now at a very early stage. We have announced investments of 117 billion euros or dollars currently in Europe, and there are announced electrolyzer capacities of 80 gigawatts in Europe, and both of those numbers are about a third of the global hydrogen economy. So also big economic stake here that is being developed, and that of course plays a role in the development of these strategies in Europe, in Germany, and also elsewhere. You can see that Europe is still in a quite favorable position when we look here at patents. We see that especially in hydrogen storage, but also in hydrogen production. So in electrolyzers, European companies or European actors have a very important share of the patents. So still a very favorable position, not as much so in fuel cells there. Japan is really the leader. And we can also see that when we look at this diagram, that China is still lagging behind. It's not a significant leader yet in these technologies. But when we look at actual production capacity in some of these large economies, then we see that this 2023 is projected, but for probably a very sort of relatively accurate projection of electrolyzer capacities. And we can see here that China is actually one of the biggest producers also of electrolyzer-based hydrogen, which implies that China is probably going to be utilizing its strength in really catching up also in this technology the way it has in many others. See, it's not moving my slides. So, but one of the questions that's also at stake is obviously not just the electrolyzer technology, but also the end uses of hydrogen. This is what makes actually the hydrogen sector such a big challenge. I mean, when we look back, maybe just take a very quick step back and we look at the development of renewable energy technologies like wind and solar technologies, we didn't have this dilemma of where the electricity would be used. It was clear it would be fed into the electricity grid, and this was a very kind of simple proposition. I mean, we simply need to develop these energy supply technologies so that, or electricity generation technologies, and there's no question about really the demand for these for this electricity. The demand was there, and it could be it was a pretty straightforward story. But here we see that there's so many potential uses, and I alluded to the fact that, you know, where we actually use this hydrogen will drastically potentially change the total amount of renewable energy we actually need. Direct electrification, where it's possible, is always the more efficient route. That means if we want to go down the hydrogen route, we need to use a lot more electricity, a lot more renewable resources to actually generate the energy needed to decarbonize these end-use sectors. But there are some, and that's mainly the industry, where we don't have any other options. Steel and chemical industries require hydrogen to decarbonize, but in the transport sector, it becomes much more messy. Shipping and aviation, there's also, I think, a degree of clarity that hydrogen will play a role there. In the other end-use sectors or the other transport sectors, it's much less clear, and even less so in heating, although there are countries like the UK that are placing heating also at the center of their hydrogen strategies. So there's really a mix, but that means that there's also, you know, there's not just a competition technologically, but also a competition in sort of defining and deciding where the hydrogen will be used, and where countries want to actually compete and be part of the hydrogen economy. And of course, that's also sort of a political economy question. Internally, domestically in those countries, you know, where does the country want to position itself? So this is another big question that the hydrogen economy entails. In Europe, like I said, one of the target sectors is the industry sector. This is a hard to electrify or impossible to electrify sector. These are big, you know, they have a large footprint in terms of jobs. Europe still captures about 15% of steel and chemical production globally. Here, the chemical sector, 594 billion in sales. And in both cases, both in the steel and the chemical sector, Germany is the big player in Europe, but followed by countries like France and Italy, and also Poland. And of course, we see also it has some significant, it's a significant carbon footprint, but also significant in terms of jobs. So this is a very important area where there's also competition, geopolitical sort of positioning going on. Germany especially wants to retain those sectors, so it wants to potentially import hydrogen, lots of hydrogen, to be able to do so. But there are also other countries, and I'll explain the map in a second, that obviously have ambitions to not only maybe decarbonize existing steel or chemical production, but maybe to use the fact that they have abundant renewable resources to attract those industries to their countries, to develop value creation around industrial production in countries where this is not yet the case, or where this is only sort of emerging in terms of a significant part of value creation. And it's an opportunity to develop within a future climate neutral economy. How am I doing with time? I should wrap up, Marco?
Yes, please.
Okay, yeah.
So a couple more minutes if you want.
Yeah. Well, maybe just very quickly, sorry, I didn't time this well enough. So final sort of thing that's at stake is so I talked about the location of industrial production. Now there's also the question of how will we produce hydrogen. This is also a sort of a competitive race within the hydrogen economy. Nuclear, gas with carbon, and gas-based hydrogen with carbon capture and storage. I've mainly been talking about renewable hydrogen, but there's also that option. And then of course the classic renewables. And here I have a map of that we have. I'm not going to go into it, but you can see that even in Europe there are very different positions on these things, and this is just contrasting whether countries support or don't support nuclear or so-called blue hydrogen based on gas for the hydrogen economy. And then we also have big differences between the US, Europe, and China, with China not really having any current policy on that, the US being clearly on blue and green, or blue and renewable, and then the European Union trying to focus very much on renewables, but having a lot of interest coming in from different member states to really revise that and change that to open up also to other forms of hydrogen production. And so with that, I've tried to really walk through some of the major issues that are at stake in the hydrogen production and what it might mean for Europe. So thank you, and sorry for going a bit over time.
Thank you, Rainer. Actually, it was a very good, excellent introduction to the topic. Just a note to the audience, I forgot to say before, we will have a Q&A at the end after all the presentations. So you're most welcome to write your questions in the chat, and we'll then take them all together, maybe selecting the ones that specifically focus on hydrogen, but we'll try to go through all of them. Right, at this point, a quick note, in the program, you will see that there has been a slight change, not a major change in terms of substance and guests. We had Rita Strohmeyer, who will now be replaced by her colleague, excellent replacement, Dr. Andreas Stamm, who is project lead and senior researcher in the research program Transformation of Economic and Social Systems at the German Institute of Development and Sustainability. He works, among other things, on science and technology for sustainable development, global value chains, and sustainable development. And he has published several works recently also on hydrogen that you find on his webpage, together with Rita Strohmeyer, by the way. For example, publication on green hydrogen and implications for international cooperation, with special reference to South Africa. So Andreas will tell us about several topics, including green hydrogen developments in the global south. Thank you very much, Andreas. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I hope you can see my presentation. Yes.
Yes, we can.
Just a very brief introduction to my institute. We are now Institute for Development and Sustainability. Until recently, we were known as the German Development Institute. We are a think tank for the German government, mainly for the Ministry of Development Cooperation. So our main mission is to do research and policy advice in the broader field of international cooperation and development cooperation. So my view is very much on green hydrogen and what it implies for developing countries. And I'm working in the HIPAD project that Rainer also mentioned at the beginning. And Rita is my very close colleague, and we are a small group at the IDAS working on the green hydrogen, mainly with the overarching questions, what is in it for developing countries? And I want to take from Rainer's presentation just one data. Is Europe wants to import to 10 million tons of green hydrogen in the year 2030. So this means we need a lot of exporting countries wishing to export this raw material to Europe. And this is our main questions. Which developing countries would be willing to go for it, and why? Because it's not a trivial question what are the benefits of developing countries. We did a couple of in-depth studies in the HIPAD project. I will focus, if my presentation works, it doesn't, yes. I will today focus on 3 Latin American countries. That in one I did an in-depth research, that is Costa Rica, then Chile and Uruguay. That Chile is one of the front runners in the green hydrogen export business, or at least on paper, and Uruguay is also seen as a strong partner of Europe in exporting green hydrogen. I will question a little bit this front runners and export thing. I will travel to Argentina and Uruguay in 2 weeks' time to start researching on more in-depth in both countries on hydrogen policy making. This is a nice graph to show that the number of hydrogen strategies in the world has been exploding since the year 2020. And also a couple of developing countries have introduced green hydrogen strategies and roadmaps since then. Many of them are in Latin America, by the way. I will not go into detail, but we'll continue with one of the countries that is seen as, it doesn't forward, let me, yeah, no. Chile. Chile is seen as a front runner in renewable energy production in Latin America, and also is seen as a very strong partner of Europe in the green hydrogen business. It has a very good renewable energy potential, both in solar and wind. Chile hosts the Atacama Desert, that's the most, the driest and hottest place on Earth. There's, for example, the European Southern Observatory is there because it's the driest place, so there's no numerosity and so on that might hinder this kind of observatories. But also it has a very high potential of solar energy. And there are calculations that might produce hydrogen already on a rather low cost. In the south, it's wind, basically. In the extreme south of Chile, the Magallanes region also has a very big potential of green hydrogen at a very low cost. In the northern part, solar energy will be used or is already used in solar, concentrating solar power and PV projects. When it comes to green hydrogen production, when we want to produce green hydrogen, we need one important resource, that is clean water. To produce 1 kilo of hydrogen, we need around 10 liters of clean water. We cannot use any kind of water, but it has to be very clean. So it's clear that seawater has to be desalinated. And already in this region, there are 8 desalination plants operating in northern Chile, mainly serving the copper mines. The cost issue when it comes to desalinating seawater is not the major one. There are estimates that to desalinate 1 ton of seawater, it will cost $3 US. So it's not the cost issue, but these desalination plants have to be built and the environmental issues have to be dealt with, because water desalination has its negative environmental impacts. Though it is good, and in the southern part, just I want to mention one pilot project, Haru-Oni, the first really working plant, but on a very experimental scale to produce hydrogen-based e-fuels. By the way, financed mainly by Siemens and Porsche. And now the question is, will they go beyond the experimental and pilot project stage? This is just to give the background on the resources in this country, so big resource, but what does it mean for their hydrogen strategy? We analyzed the hydrogen strategy and roadmaps of these 3 countries. Chile has a very well-developed green hydrogen strategy, and now I want to have a look at their phasing. And we can see that there might be a really relevant phase shift between the import wishes and needs of Germany and Europe and the export wishes and needs of a developing country like Chile. Chile has designed 3 waves of green hydrogen production from 2020 to 2025. It's basically the domestic market and export preparation. From 2025 to 2030, there will be first exports of ammonia. So it's a derivative from hydrogen. But it will be first exports. And only after 2030, Chile projects to be a major exporter of green hydrogen. And this is what I mean with phase shifts. In 2030, Germany wants to import 2.4 million tons of green hydrogen. And the big question is where it might come from. By the way, until now, there is no international trade of green hydrogen at all. So it's a very new business, and the big question is what will be the chemical form of transporting hydrogen over large distances. So I see a big phase shift between export needs and wishes of developing countries and what might be the import needs. Worse even for Germany, in the green hydrogen strategy of Chile, they see who will be the markets for Chilean exports. And if we look at the upper half of the slide, green ammonia exports, there Europe is very much in the center of attention of Chile, but it's not the only off-taker of green ammonia. And if we look at green hydrogen exports as such, in the long run, there will be Japan and Korea as very big off-takers of green hydrogen from Chile, because
it seems that Andreas' connection is breaking up a bit. All right, Andreas, can you hear us?
Now I'm back, yes. 2 things, 2 main messages from Chile. Chile will start to be a big exporter if everything works well in 2030, not immediately. So Europe and Germany have to think about whether this is their ambitious goals for importing green hydrogen from the global south is realistic. I can now briefly skip over the next 2 slides because it's 2 other countries that have basically the same message. It doesn't move. Uruguay, small country, but also has very ambitious goals in the green hydrogen economy. But also here you can see by 2030, very slow, very low amounts of green hydrogen exporting international and national market. And only from 2035 and then 2040, it will be a bigger chunk that might be imported from Uruguay. It's the same as Costa Rica. I could speak a lot because I made an in-depth study. They basically think about using green hydrogen locally. So what we see is that many countries are following a dual and gradual approach. So they do not want to go for very big projects, but they want to do something like buying time before going for large exports, because there's a lot of uncertainties in the whole issue. The countries are not very sure whether these export markets for green hydrogen will be certain in the future. Will Europe continue giving preference to green over blue hydrogen? Will import via pipelines destroy the opportunities of transcontinental hydrogen traded by ships? Are the costs that are involved? Currently, there is no market price for hydrogen. And what will be the dominant technology for transporting hydrogen? Is it liquefied hydrogen? Is it ammonia? Or is it liquefied organic hydrogen carrier? So 3 modes of transporting. And a very big question that I don't see why so few people discuss it. Currently, we don't have enough sea vessels to transport these amounts of hydrogen. So, and when will this be available? The ships have to be built. A big vessel ship needs several years to be designed and built. So there are a lot of uncertainties. We are working on a paper on it. And while the countries in the global south do not know when these uncertainties will be resolved, they are trying to buy time and say, okay, we use hydrogen as much as we can locally, and then we can also go step by step. And now I go for the last slide. So we have a gradual approach in many countries. It makes sense from our reading of the reality, because the countries are in a high and under a high level of uncertainties. Dual approach, we mean it using locally and exporting. I think it makes a lot of sense because countries want to learn about the technologies. It's a completely new technology for most countries, not only the global south. So they want to do learning by doing and learning by interacting. And they want to gain a relative independence from export markets. My last remark, Latin America was a seedbed of the so-called dependency theory in the last century, and not being dependent from market decisions and technological developments in the global north has a very high priority in Latin America. And the last remark, sometimes German policymakers say, we will import huge amounts of green hydrogen from the south and export hydrogen technologies to the south to the benefit of both. But this is exactly what the Latin American countries do not want, because it's a very old model of unequal change and dependency that they do not want. With this, I want to stop, and sorry for the technicalities.
Thank you very much, Andreas, and also for these excellent points, which also introduce a perspective from the global south, from Central America, and also for your points on the challenges which are often overlooked. Okay, now we move on to Timo's presentation. I briefly introduced Timo before, so he's gonna tell us about well, some of the insights from his forthcoming FIIA briefing paper. So follow our publications also for the final written product. But today, so he's also gonna talk about hydrogen potential and debates in the Gulf and MENA regions. So please, Timo, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Marco. I take it you can see my presentation. It's a pleasure to be with you today amongst this esteemed panel. I have to say I don't have a background as an energy analyst, but I come from Middle East regional studies. I've been based in the Gulf for over a decade now, and so my presentation will be influenced by that, of course. As Marcus said, I'm going to give a small case study of the Arabian Gulf countries to add to what we've already heard. I think what's notable is that the Arabian Gulf is widely considered to have one of the best potentials for the production of hydrogen because of its geography. You know, it has a lot of solar power, it has a lot of land, and it's very well connected to some of the regions which will have the highest demands, which is Europe and Asia, of course. And so it's unsurprising that over the last few years, not so long, you have seen a string of very ambitious projects being announced in the Gulf countries when it comes to hydrogen production. On this slide, you see on the left the Al Dhafra solar PV plant in Abu Dhabi, which has it's a 2.2 gigawatt plant, which has produced the lowest cost solar energy in 2020 at about 1.35 cents per kilowatt hour, you know, which demonstrates like the high potential of solar produced hydrogen you have in this region. And on the right, you have the Helios project in Saudi Arabia at Oxygen Port, which, you know, is one of these massive projects that is being planned for the production of hydrogen. I want to start with a couple of considerations on how hydrogen is going to, you know, be different from oil. Obviously, the GCC countries are major oil producers. They're at the center of the current hydrocarbon economy. But as we switch from hydrocarbons to hydrogen, things would change quite a bit. And I just want to make a couple of basic points there, which you see on this slide. So oil, of course, is something that's being extracted, whereas hydrogen is being manufactured. I think that's something that we have to keep in mind, and that changes, the way we deal with it. It can be manufactured anywhere in the world. All you need is electricity and water, essentially, and you can make hydrogen. Oil comes from particular, one region and some others as well. But the GCC countries have a very strong competitive advantage when it comes to the extraction of oil. So, production is being concentrated in some specific reasons for oil, but it's very dispersed. For hydrogen, you saw that on Rainer's maps as well. And, there's various locations all across the world. This will have an impact on supply chains and trade corridors, of course. Oil has, had the tendency to be very concentrated. It allowed the creation of a cartel in the form of OPEC. The hydrogen market is likely to be very different in the future, and hydrogen producers are more likely to be price takers. That their price is going to be set by the market. Oil has relatively low transport costs, as we just heard from Andreas. For hydrogen, it's going to be quite difficult. There's still a lot of question marks about transportation, but the costs are likely to be higher in relation to the value of the product than for oil. The transport volumes for oil were quite high, whereas for hydrogen, we are likely to see more regionalized market, and so there may be overall a lower volume of transports, as we have some of the estimates suggest as well, and that's also the last point. So hydrogen is likely to be more of a regional market than a global market. On the whole, I think hydrogen sort of will favor a dispersion of power rather than a concentration of power, as we've seen during the oil era, where it's the control of the market was in the hands of a few producers, a few oil companies, and competition was centered around a few strategic corridors. Now let me go from this, to the hydrogen ambitions of the GCC countries. As I said, the GCC countries have a huge potential, or a significant potential, at least when it comes to hydrogen production. And they have announced a number of projects over the last few years. The most important countries when it comes to this are Saudi Arabia, Oman, and the UAE. Saudi Arabia will, has announced a target of 2.9 million tons a year by 2030 for hydrogen production, going up to 4 by 2035. It's essentially a combination in Saudi, where they will try to produce green hydrogen in the western parts of the country around NEOM, whereas they're planning to produce blue hydrogen in the eastern regions using shale gas. Oman has staked a lot on the production of hydrogen. They have very ambitious plans. Initially, slightly slower in 2030, 1 to 1.25 million tons, but then going up very ambitiously to 8.5 million tons by 2050. A lot of this will be green hydrogen, these plans require very significant investments in the range of $33 billion plus that they're trying to elicit at this stage. And finally, we have the UAE, which is targeting about 1 million tons, although they're likely to update that goal soon by 2030. and have set themselves the goal of supplying 25% of global demand for clean hydrogen in that same time period. There's a number of projects in the country, amongst others. The UAE had the first hydrogen test plant in the MENA region in Dubai. There's another project, the Kisat port, which is being developed. Since this is a very German heavy panel that we're having today, it's also good to note that the German government is the German companies rather are quite strongly involved in UAE projects. Now, all of this looks great. There's a lot of potential, a lot of projects being planned. However, there's a trade-off that has to be made, which is between the production for export and the domestic demand as well. As you can see, some of the renewable energy targets that these countries have set themselves aren't yet that ambitious. There's still some room upwards, and they will want to improve their renewable energy supply domestically as well. Saudi Arabia's target is more ambitious, but they have missed some of these targets in the past, so I wouldn't necessarily believe it's set in stone. In addition to that, the GCC are going to have a strong domestic demand for hydrogen as well, which is estimated in the 25 to 50 million tons range per year in 2050. That's a big range, obviously, demonstrating perhaps how uncertain some of these things are. Like in the case of Latin America, there's an issue when it comes to water. This is a water scarce region, even though it has a huge amount of desalination capacity already, the Gulf. And so this is an issue that can potentially be solved. There are also attempts underway to upgrade technology so that salt water can be used for electrolyzers. And so there's maybe some technological avenues in the future that make that less of an issue. However, for the time being, there may be some environmental concerns when it comes to this, and there's a trade-off to where you use the renewable power. When it comes to blue hydrogen, there's the carbon capture, utilization, and storage issue. The region has some capacity built already and is planning more capacity around that. But there is a need for regulation because right now these technologies don't capture all of the emissions at this stage. And apart from regulating and setting standards, when it comes to CCUS, there would also be a need for monitoring, which tends to be an issue in some parts of this world. Nevertheless, the GCC countries have an early mover advantage. They are certainly going to see some of the most intense activity around hydrogen over the next decade. And the reasons for that are obvious. One of them is that the GCC countries are amongst those countries which have the best investment capacities. The sovereign wealth funds in the region are well supplied. They're major investors in hydrogen projects. So the GCC countries have an ability to pilot and create a market at a speed that other regions do not have. Secondly, there is indeed the fact of planning and implementation in this part of the world is significantly faster on average than, let's say, in Europe. So that will help most likely GCC countries to solidify their first mover advantage. There's an existing energy infrastructure, one of the most developed in the world, of course, because of hydrocarbons that the Arabian Gulf countries are able to tap into. and that would be important for, you know, to favor a quick ramp up of export eventually. And there's skilled labor in this part of the world when it comes to the petrochemical industries, which of course, you know, is also equally important. And I may add that possibly all of these 4 points are at least an issue in some parts of Europe. And hence, you know, will to some extent enable the GCC countries to move ahead at some speed. There are already a lot of projects ongoing, except for the plant hydrogen production capacities. There have been test cargoes of blue ammonia from Saudi Arabia to Japan, from the UAE to Germany, and so on. The region is also making a big bet on sustainable aviation fuels, which they indeed have a possible advantage in producing. And there's also the potential to produce green products, green steel, green aluminum, and others. On the right, you see solar aluminum, which is being produced by Amherst Global Aluminium, which is BMW, amongst others, is buying in bulk to help them with their decarbonization goals. So this is a larger point to keep in mind, that this region is in the future not going to look only at the export of hydrogen, but also at the potential of hydrogen to transform its own industry and to become a producer at scale. Finally, a couple of geopolitical implications, considerations, let's say, when we think about you know, hydrogen, the transition towards hydrogen and its impact on the region. First, I think what we can expect is that over the next decade, the GCC will not become less important, but actually more important for global energy markets. Not only have countries in the region the desire to be the last man standing when it comes to producing oil and gas, and they have a very strong capacities to that as being one of the lowest cost producers. But in addition, they are heavily diversifying towards hydrogen. And so they essentially will be important players on both levels. And this will, in the next decade, make them very central players in energy questions going forward. This may change, you know, in a decade or two, as the, you know, global demand picture is changing. The second point is that I think it's very possible to see that we will see GCC countries emerge as strong industrial hubs as a result of the transition to hydrogen, rather than shipping, you know, hydrogen in some of its forms. They are eager to ship the steel and the aluminum and other products that are, you know, being produced with hydrogen. And as the region ramps up its capacities, there will be a strong competition who builds these capacities and who will regulate them. Currently, there's you know, strong influence of European countries, ThyssenKrupp and so on, that are involved in projects down here. But there's also a lot of Asians competitors and the Chinese who are building some of the cheapest electrolyzers in the world at a fraction of the cost of Europe, are also entering the market very strongly. This is a picture we will continue to see. There will be a strong technological competition from all that we know, and when it comes to electrolyzers and fuel cells. This competition will probably reinforce on a global level what we see right now in terms of formation of blocks. Whereas China is sort of trying to become a regional power, at least in this part of the world, and Europe is becoming more skeptical towards de-risking some of its engagement with China. Long debates, also followed by FIIA, very interesting. There will be more of that. The GCC sits kind of in the middle, and they will be seeking to navigate that fissure. But if pushed, they may lean towards the side that's more profitable and easier for them to deal with. Finally, in the very long term, I think it's important to just mention that hydrogen will not be able to generate the same kind of rents than oil and gas will in the long run. It's because the way it is, because of its geopolitical properties, because it is manufactured, because the price differentials aren't that high. They are, significant, but the after shipment and extraction and so on, the Gulf hydrogen may not be that much cheaper than the European hydrogen in some cases. And so, the revenues that can be gleaned from this will be lower in the long run. And that will change the global energy system quite significantly. It will also change potentially the social contracts in some countries in the region, and that will have broader implications. I think I stop here. I've been going over time, so thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much, Timo. Now we have about 10 minutes for questions. You can write them in the chat, and I see that there were already some. Well, there was a discussion about electrolyzers capable of using salty water. Several points were made. There is no specific question here. There was also one point about nuclear power. Let me just say on this that we will have another webinar in November that will look at nuclear power more closely. So we'll come back to that topic in that webinar, if you keep following us, of course. So feel free to ask. And in the meantime, I have a couple of questions to our speakers. A general question, actually, to all of you concerns international cooperation in the hydrogen economy. Some points were already made about transportation issues. So my question is, overall, do you see, or to what extent do you see cooperation, or is it going to be mostly clubs of countries cooperating bilaterally, and so on? So this is a general question to everyone. Then, following the order of presentations, I would ask Rainer if you can comment on the role of rules and governance. How is this important, and is it going to foster geopolitical competition, in your opinion? So we start with Rainer, and then we follow the order of presentations.
Thank you, Marco, for the question. I mean, maybe just to the point of blocks, formation of blocks around hydrogen. I don't know if I agree entirely, because I mean, as Timo said, I mean, the hydrogen can actually be produced pretty much anywhere. I mean, as I said, hydrogen could also produce in significant amounts in Europe if the desire was there to do so, right? If we were willing in Europe to really build that infrastructure also in maybe places where people aren't comfortable with having renewable energy generation. This is the main issue. It's not that it's not possible per se. So if there's this does provide scope for really, if there are issues around supply of hydrogen, there is that possibility of developing domestic supply, reinforcing the domestic supply, diversifying, etc. And in terms of like actual sort of activities, cooperation that's going on, surprisingly, I mean, Germany really is at the forefront. So is Japan, more in the Asia Pacific, starting to cooperate very heavily with Australia. But I don't see a block, Japan-Australia block versus, you know, some kind of a Germany-led block, because I mean, I don't think Australia would be interested in that kind of a development. And that doesn't mean Germany will be importing a lot of hydrogen from Australia, right? But there's definitely cooperation also going on between Germany and Australia, more on the technology development, sort of, dialogue and infrastructure questions and stuff like that. So, and what we also see is that the US and China are not that active right now. I mean, China has a partnership with Saudi. I'm not exactly sure what the content of it is, but China is not that active in the hydrogen economy internationally yet. Why? Because they don't need to import hydrogen going forward. They will be able to supply their own market with hydrogen. And that's actually a huge energy security asset that this hydrogen economy is going to deliver both for China and the US. So I don't see there being that much conflict really within hydrogen between the major economies in that sense. So I'll leave it there, not to steal all the time.
Thank you very much. I wanted to actually move to Andreas, but yes, he's there. Excellent. Andreas, if you can hear us.
Yes.
There is a question in the chat, which which I think is quite close to your expertise, because you were talking about a perspective from the global south. The question is about, in this case, about Namibia, but it's an example. Why not produce clean steel and fertilizers directly for export rather than shipping, for example, ammonia to Europe? So why not skip this passage? And is it a bit what you were saying, that the global south doesn't want to export hydrogen like raw materials, but rather become an end producer?
I will switch off my camera, hoping that the connection will be better. Do you hear me?
We can hear you
I
very
have
well.
very big technicalities here. I just wanted to mention this club issue also, because for me, the hydrogen issue is very much linked to industrial policies. Germany has, in its strategy, says clearly we want to be the market leader in green hydrogen technologies. And there's, of course, a competition with the US. US has now, 2 years ago, launched its green hydrogen initiative. They want to bring down the costs of green hydrogen production to $1 per kilo in 1 decade. This is called 1-1-1 strategy. So there's a big competition in the technological field. And this is, of course, not fostering into multilateral cooperation also. I think there are issues that should be dealt with on the multilateral or international level, like the transport issue. If every country if Germany decides to import green ammonia and US wants was liquefied hydrogen, then the producing countries are in a difficult situation. But just to mention this, about this building of hydrogen in the south, of course, to build a steel plant requires a lot of technical expertise, and Namibia doesn't have it. What I see, funny enough, is now the first European steel plant will be built in northern Sweden. This is probably the region in Europe that is most benefiting from the green hydrogen topic. The first green steel plant will be built close to Luleå in Lapland. And the first Spanish fertilizer company wants to produce green ammonia fertilizer in the same region because they have incredibly low electricity prices based on wind and water, on hydropower. And the same might happen once there is a big supply of green hydrogen in Morocco or in Brazil, most likely. Then I guess that steel production will shift to these countries, but it's of course not a deliberate policy of Germany to say, okay, we say goodbye to our steel industry. That's clearly against the wishes of the German government. But it will happen, but in a very slow pace, I guess. That's my guess.
Right. Thank you very much. And this also somewhat answers another question concerning the hype for hydrogen in the EU and in Finland. You mentioned an example from the Nordics. Unfortunately, there's a lot of questions, which pleases me. We'll probably not be able to address them all, but I see one concerning the fall in revenue from fossil fuels, which Timo touched upon, and hydrogen, on the other hand, producing or yielding revenues indefinitely. Timo, would you like to engage with this question and with the general points we discussed earlier, with my general question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, on the revenue side, I think you know, in the GCC, about 60% of government budgets come from you know, the revenue of oil and gas. Yeah, and you know, that will stay probably like this for some time to come. And you know, oil and gas is finite, that's true, but it will take some time still before it runs out. The issue is that the you know, even if hydrogen can be produced indefinitely, it will provide a lot less revenue, right? So the redistribution mechanisms that are currently in place won't work the same way in the future than they're working now, when you have a lot of revenue from stuff that you extract from the ground. Just a quick point on the blocks issue. I think you know, I mean, two points to that. One is, as Rainer said, I think you know, the US and China have the ability to be islands upon themselves when it comes to the production of hydrogen. They don't necessarily need the world, whereas for Europe, you know, what makes the most sense in the foreseeable future seems to be you know, focusing on the regional partners, North Africa, you know, piping oil, piping hydrogen in the foreseeable future. So there will be some default, you know, spaces that may be having different regulatory mechanisms, different supply chains than we have today. Today, the trades of oil and LNG is essentially global. You know, and that may change in the future, even though indeed there are attempts to source hydrogen from Australia and so on, from Germany and from Namibia, etc. So I think the question is how that will impact geopolitics in this current environment where we are already very charged and there's a lot of tension between the different players. The second point is that, you know, this is also about technological competition, as Andreas said, right? So it is not only about where to get the hydrogen from, but who will supply the technology in the future. And I think there is a strong competition between German, you know, technology or European technology and Chinese technology, and that in itself will probably foster some block formation, just as we see with 5G, for example. You know, Huawei has completely conquered the GCC countries. It's the only technology there to some extent. So you know, once you lock in dependencies, they may have a long-term impact, of course. Anyways, I'm sorry over time, so I'll stop here.
Well, thank you very much, and also for addressing some of the questions that were coming up in the chat. And Rainer, I see that you have been replying in writing also in the chat, so that simplifies my task a lot. There's indeed several issues that we couldn't touch upon. We did talk about issues concerning long-distance transportation and export of hydrogen. Another question that perhaps could have been addressed or could have asked is the potential for carbon lock-in coming from hydrogen, blue hydrogen. So these are all very important questions that unfortunately we do not have time to discuss at the moment because I think our speakers also have multiple commitments. But I'm very pleased to see that there is a lot of interest in the topic, and I'm very glad that we had excellent presentations from our speakers today, which I would like to thank very much for taking the time to participate in this webinar. So we'll come back to this. Let me just say at the end that this project has a web page. I'll post it in the chat in a moment. So we'll continue talking about the global politics of the energy transition. Keep following our webinars. Thanks very much to all of you, to the speakers for contributing, and I hope to see you soon. And to the audience, which was very engaging and with excellent questions. So the seminar is closed. Thank you very much once again, and have a good day.